A bright sunny day welcomed a group of tourists to the famous palace gates. The air was filled with excitement as people clicked pictures, admired the grand architecture, and chatted about the history of the place. Among the visitors was a group of young tourists who were more interested in fun than history. They laughed loudly, took selfies, and looked around for something entertaining to do. As they wandered near the entrance, their eyes landed on a royal guard standing tall and motionless. Dressed in a sharp uniform with polished boots, he held his rifle firmly, his expression serious and focused. His job was to stand still, no matter what happened around him. He was trained to ignore distractions, which made him even more fascinating to the tourists. One of them pointed at him and chuckled, "Look at this guy. He doesn't even blink." Another one waved a hand in front of his face, trying to get a reaction. The guard didn't move an inch. His discipline made the tourists even more eager to test his patience. They started making funny faces, clapping their hands, and saying silly things. A few bystanders watched with curiosity, but no one dared to stop them. Encouraged by the attention, one of the tourists got a playful idea. "Let's see how far we can go," he whispered to his friends. Without thinking twice, he pulled a rope from his backpack. "Let's tie him up for fun and see what he does," he added, laughing. His friends found the idea amusing, and in their excitement, they went along with it. Carefully, they moved closer, making sure no security officers were watching. They started wrapping the rope around the guard, giggling as they did. To their surprise, he still didn't react. His face remained strong, his posture straight, just like a statue. His training had taught him to endure such moments without breaking his discipline. As they finished tying the rope around him, they took out their phones and started taking pictures and videos. "This is going to be so funny online," one of them said, already imagining the number of likes and comments they would get. They posed beside the guard, pretending to salute him while laughing at their prank. Little did they know, the palace had strict security measures in place. A camera hidden nearby had captured everything, and someone was already watching their actions on a screen. The tourists thought they were being clever, but they had no idea that their fun was about to take an unexpected turn. While they continued to enjoy their joke, a silent alarm was triggered inside the palace security room. A team of highly trained guards received the signal and immediately sprang into action. Without saying a word, they prepared to respond, moving in perfect coordination. The tourists, still unaware of what was coming, were about to experience something they would never forget. The tourists were still laughing, proud of their little prank. They checked their phones, watching the videos they had just recorded. One of them even uploaded a picture with a funny caption, expecting it to go viral. They had no idea that trouble was already on its way. A few other visitors at the palace watched the scene with mixed reactions. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others hesitated, unsure whether to interfere. But before anyone could step in, something changed. The atmosphere around the palace suddenly became tense. The quiet laughter of the tourists slowly faded as they noticed a few people whispering and pointing towards the entrance. Unbeknownst to them, the palace security team had already seen everything through the surveillance cameras. Inside a control room, a guard picked up a radio and spoke in a firm voice, "We have a situation at the main entrance." Royal Guard compromised. Immediate response required. Within seconds, an alert was sent to an elite team of soldiers who were always on standby for emergencies. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard who had been tied to the pole remained as still as ever. He did not flinch, did not struggle, and did not break his posture. His training had prepared him for all kinds of distractions, and he knew that discipline was the most important part of his duty. Even in an uncomfortable situation, he stood tall, knowing that help would arrive soon. The tourists, however, were still unaware of the trouble they had caused. One of them playfully patted the guard on the shoulder. "Hey, come on, man. Say something," he joked. Another tourist took another picture, grinning widely. Just as they were about to continue their teasing, something caught their attention. A rhythmic, powerful sound echoed through the palace grounds, the synchronized footsteps of an approaching group. The tourists turned their heads and saw a squad of royal guards marching towards them. Their movements were perfectly in sync, their boots striking the ground with firm precision. Their expressions were serious, their eyes locked on the scene in front of them. For the first time, the tourists felt uneasy. The sight of the approaching squad, dressed in their crisp uniforms and moving with such authority, made them realize that this was no longer a joke. The laughter stopped. The smiles disappeared. One of them whispered, I think we should go." But it was already too late. The squad reached the scene within seconds. Without saying a word, they swiftly moved into formation, surrounding the tied-up guard and the group of tourists. The sudden shift in atmosphere was almost overwhelming. The once carefree tourists now felt a deep sense of regret as the realization hit them. They had made a huge mistake. As the lead guard stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the group. The tourists could feel the weight of their actions pressing down on them. Their fun little prank had turned into something serious, and they were about to face the consequences of their thoughtless actions. The air around the palace gates had changed completely. What had started as a silly prank now felt like a serious situation. The tourists stood frozen in place, their eyes shifting between each other, unsure of what to do. The sound of the marching guards had sent a wave of fear through them. They had never expected things to turn out like this. The squad of royal guards stopped right in front of them, standing in a perfect line. Their uniforms were spotless, their boots shined, and their eyes were filled with silent authority. They didn't yell, they didn't show anger, yet their presence alone was enough to make the tourists nervous. One of the tourists, trying to act casual, chuckled nervously. "But we were just joking," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "No harm done, right?" But the guards didn't react. Instead, the leader of the squad took a step forward. His sharp gaze scanned the group before shifting to the tied-up royal guard. With a simple nod, 2 guards swiftly moved to untie their fellow soldier. They worked quickly and precisely, their movements practiced and disciplined. As soon as the rope was removed, the royal guard straightened his posture and saluted the squad leader. His expression remained as strong as ever, showing no sign of discomfort or anger. He simply stood tall, proving that he had not let the prank affect his duty. The tourists watched in silence, feeling smaller by the second. They had thought it was all just a game, but now they were starting to understand the weight of their mistake. Then, without warning, the squad leader turned his attention back to them. His eyes locked onto the group, making them shift uncomfortably. He didn't have to raise his voice to make them feel guilty. His silence alone spoke volumes. One of the tourists swallowed hard. We didn't mean any disrespect," he mumbled. Another one quickly nodded. "Yeah, we were just messing around. We didn't think it was a big deal." The squad leader remained silent for a moment, then gave a sharp gesture. A few more guards stepped forward, this time from the palace security team. Unlike the royal guards, these officers were responsible for maintaining order and ensuring that the rules were followed. They had seen everything on the security cameras, and now it was time to take action. The tourists suddenly realized that they weren't just going to be scolded and sent away. There would be real consequences for what they had done. One of them tried to reason with the security officers. "Come on, we're tourists. We didn't know." But the officer cut him off with a simple wave of his hand. "You should have known," the officer said firmly. "Disrespecting a royal guard is not a joke." The tourists exchanged nervous glances. What had started as a few harmless laughs was now turning into something much more serious. The fun was over, and now they had to face the results of their actions. The tourists felt a heavy silence surrounding them. Just moments ago, they had been laughing and joking, thinking their prank was harmless. But now, standing in front of the serious-looking security officers and the disciplined royal guards, they realized how wrong they had been. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "What you have done is not acceptable," he said in a calm but firm voice. "The royal guards are not here for your entertainment. They serve an important duty, and you have disrespected that." The tourists lowered their heads. They wanted to protest, to explain that they hadn't meant any harm, but deep down, they knew there was no excuse. What they had done was wrong, and now they had to face the consequences. Another officer spoke up. "Do you know how serious this is? These guards are symbols of honor and discipline. You may think it was just a joke, but in reality, you have insulted the traditions of this palace." The weight of those words sank in. The tourists had been so focused on getting laughs and social media attention that they hadn't considered the deeper meaning behind the guard's role. He wasn't just standing there for show. He was part of something much bigger. A few of them exchanged nervous glances. One of them hesitantly asked, "Are we in trouble?" The officers didn't answer immediately. Instead, one of them pulled out a small notepad and started writing something down. Another officer took out a radio and spoke into it in a language the tourists couldn't understand. The uncertainty made them even more anxious. A few bystanders had gathered at a distance, whispering to each other and watching the scene unfold. The tourists could feel their stares, making them even more embarrassed. What had once been a funny moment for them was now turning into public humiliation. Finally, the officer with the notepad looked up. "You will be taken for questioning," he said firmly. "There will be consequences for your actions." The words hit the tourists like a wave. One of them panicked. "Wait, we're sorry. We didn't know it was this serious." Another one quickly added, "Yeah, we'll delete the videos. We won't do anything like this again." But the officers remained unmoved. Apologizing now wouldn't change what had already happened. The security team gestured for the tourists to follow them, and with no other choice, they obeyed. As they walked away from the palace gates, escorted by security, they could still hear the disciplined footsteps of the royal guards behind them. The guard they had tied up had returned to his post, standing tall as if nothing had happened. The tourists couldn't help but look back at him one last time. He had shown more strength and dignity in silence than they had with all their loud words and actions. And now, as they were led away to face the consequences, they finally understood the true meaning of respect. The tourists walked in silence, their excitement from earlier completely gone. Their steps were slow, their hearts heavy with regret. They never thought a simple prank could lead to something this serious. Now, escorted by security officers, they felt the weight of their mistake pressing down on them. They were led through a side entrance of the palace, away from the crowds. The long, quiet hallway made them even more nervous. None of them spoke. The officers didn't yell or threaten them, but their serious expressions were enough to make the tourists feel uneasy. They had never been in a situation like this before. Finally, they reached a small office. The officers gestured for them to sit. A large wooden desk stood in the middle of the room, and behind it sat a high-ranking security officer. His uniform was different from the others, more decorated, more official. He had a calm yet commanding presence. He looked at the group, then at the report in front of him. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Do you understand why you are here?" The tourists exchanged nervous glances. One of them hesitated before saying, "Because we played a prank." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "A prank," he repeated. "Is that what you think this was?" He placed his hands on the desk and leaned forward slightly. "You tied a royal guard to a pole. You laughed at him. You took pictures and videos. And you thought this was funny." The tourists shrank in their seats. They had no defense. It sounded much worse when put into words. The officer continued, "The royal guards are not here for your amusement. They represent discipline, honor, and duty. They stand for something greater than just their presence at the gates." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "By doing what you did not just disrespect a guard. You disrespected the values he represents." The room was silent. The tourists had no idea what to say. They had never thought about it like this before. Another officer, standing near the door, added, There are strict rules in place to protect royal guards from interference. What you did could have led to serious consequences. One of the tourists, feeling a lump in his throat, whispered, "We didn't know. We're really sorry." The officer at the desk studied them for a long moment. "Sorry," he finally said. "You are only sorry because you were caught." The tourists lowered their heads. He was right. If no one had stopped them, they would have left laughing, thinking they had just pulled off a harmless joke. The officer sighed and leaned back in his chair. "There will be consequences for your actions," he said. "You are not leaving this country without understanding the seriousness of what you have done." The tourists' stomachs dropped. This was no longer just a warning. They were about to face real punishment, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The room was filled with silence, except for the quiet breathing of the nervous tourists. They sat stiffly in their chairs, their hands clenched together as they waited for what would happen next. The officer at the desk continued to study them with a calm but firm expression. His words from earlier still echoed in their minds. There would be consequences. One of the tourists swallowed hard and finally spoke. "Sir, we truly didn't mean any harm. It was just a bad joke. We regret it now." The officer tapped his fingers on the desk thoughtfully before responding. "Regret comes too late when the damage is already done," he said. "If we let you go without any consequences, what message would that send? That anyone can come here, disrespect a royal guard, and simply walk away." The tourists had no answer. They could only sit there, feeling ashamed. After a long pause, the officer sighed and motioned to another security official standing near the door. "Take their phones." The tourists stiffened in surprise. "Wait, what?" One of them blurted out. "The videos and pictures you took will be deleted immediately," the officer stated firmly. "We will not allow this kind of disrespect to be spread online." Reluctantly, the tourists handed over their phones. They watched as the security officer carefully went through their photo galleries and social media apps, ensuring that every picture and video related to the incident was erased. Once their phones were returned, the officer continued, "This is only the first step. You will not leave here without making amends." The tourists exchanged nervous glances. "What do you mean?" one of them asked cautiously. The officer's eyes remained steady. "Since you thought it was entertaining to interfere with a royal guard's duty, you will now learn what it means to stand in their place." Confused, the tourists waited for further explanation. Another officer stepped forward, holding a stack of neatly folded uniforms. "You will each put on a royal guard uniform and stand in formation at the palace gates for the next 3 hours." The tourists' eyes widened in shock. 3 hours, one of them gasped. "Yes," the officer confirmed, "and you will follow the same rules the guards follow. No movement, no talking, no reacting to anything around you. If you fail, your time will be extended." The tourists were stunned. They had expected a fine, maybe even a strict warning. But this, standing completely still under the watchful eyes of hundreds of visitors, it sounded unbearable. "Consider this a lesson," the officer said, his voice firm but fair. "Perhaps after today, you will understand the discipline and respect required to serve as a royal guard." The tourists had no choice. As they were handed the uniforms, they realized that this was going to be the longest 3 hours of their lives. The tourists stood in front of the Grand Palace, dressed in the stiff, formal uniforms of the royal guards. The heavy coats felt hot under the afternoon sun, and the polished boots were tighter than they expected. But the hardest part was yet to come. An officer stood in front of them, his sharp eyes scanning the group. "You will stand here for the next 3 hours, he repeated. "No movement, no talking, no reacting. You must remain as still as a statue, just like the guards you disrespected." The tourists nodded hesitantly. They had no choice but to obey. As they were positioned at the palace gates, they finally understood just how difficult this task was. The real royal guard stood beside them, their postures strong and perfect. The tourists tried to imitate them, but within minutes their legs began to ache, and their backs felt stiff. At first, a few visitors who had gathered nearby giggled at the sight of the tourists in uniform. Some even took pictures, whispering to each other in amusement. The tourists felt embarrassed, but knew they couldn't react. They had been warned. If they failed, their punishment would be extended. Minutes passed like hours. The sun beat down on them, sweat forming on their foreheads. A fly buzzed around one of them, landing on his nose. He fought the urge to swat it away, his entire body tense. Another tourist felt an itch on his arm, but knew he couldn't scratch it. They had never imagined that simply standing still could be so painful. As time went on, the crowd around them grew. Some people, unaware of the situation, thought the tourists were actual guards and admired their discipline. Others, who had seen the earlier incident, whispered to each other about the lesson they were being taught. One of the real royal guards glanced at the tourists out of the corner of his eye. He had stood in this position for years, trained to ignore discomfort, noise, and distractions. He could see how much the tourists were struggling. But this was their punishment. They needed to learn. After an hour, one of the tourists nearly lost his balance. His legs were trembling, and his vision blurred slightly from standing too still for too long. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay upright. Another tourist's shoulders twitched as he fought the urge to stretch. By the second hour, the tourists were exhausted. Every muscle in their bodies ached, their feet felt like they were burning, and their minds screamed at them to move. But they didn't. They had learned their lesson. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a security officer walked up to them. "Time's up," he announced. The tourists nearly collapsed with relief. Their legs felt weak as they stepped away from their posts. Their punishment was over, but the experience would stay with them forever. As they returned the uniforms, they no longer felt like the same foolish tourists who had laughed at the royal guards. They had learned the true meaning of discipline, respect, and honor. As the tourists stepped out of the stiff uniforms, they felt a deep sense of relief. Their legs ached, their backs were sore, and their feet felt as if they had been standing on fire. But more than the physical pain, there was something else they felt: understanding. The officer who had supervised their punishment stood before them. His expression was still serious, but there was now a hint of something different in his eyes, perhaps approval. "Now," he said, "do you understand why what you did was wrong?" The tourists nodded quickly. There was no hesitation, no excuses. They truly understood now. One of them took a deep breath before speaking. "We're really sorry," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "We didn't realize how much effort and discipline it takes to be a royal guard. We disrespected something we didn't understand, and now we regret it." The officer listened carefully and then gave a slight nod. "Regret is only useful if it leads to change," he said. "What matters is what you do from this moment forward." The tourists exchanged glances. They knew this experience had changed them. They had come here as careless visitors, thinking everything was just for entertainment. But now, they saw the royal guards and their duty in a completely new light. As they were led back to the main area of the palace, they noticed the same guard they had tied up earlier. He was back at his post, standing tall and proud, as if nothing had ever happened. His discipline had not wavered, his honor remained untouched. Feeling ashamed but determined to make things right, one of the tourists hesitated, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said softly. The royal guard didn't respond, of course. He was trained to ignore distractions. But that didn't matter. The tourist stood in front of him, bowed his head slightly, and said, "I'm sorry." The other tourists followed, standing beside him. They knew the guard couldn't react, but they still wanted to show their respect. They had learned their lesson, and this was their way of acknowledging their mistake. A few bystanders who had seen everything from the beginning watched in silence. Some of them nodded in approval. The tourists had made a mistake, but they had also taken responsibility for it. As they walked away from the palace, they felt different. This trip had turned into something much more meaningful than they had ever expected. It was no longer just about sightseeing or taking pictures. It had become a lesson they would never forget. One of the tourists turned to the others with a small, tired smile. "I don't think I'll ever laugh at a royal guard again." The others chuckled, but this time, it wasn't the laughter of mockery. It was the laughter of people who had grown, who had learned something valuable. And as they left the palace grounds, they carried that lesson with them, forever changed by an experience they would never forget.